My beloved child. Pause here for a moment, because what you are about to hear was not meant to pass by you unnoticed. There are times when a heart can sense a truth long before the mind is ready to name it, and lately, something inside you may have been whispering that the person you love is more complicated than the version you first came to know. Do not rush to fear what that means. Do not assume the hidden truth is darkness. Sometimes what is concealed is not betrayal, but a wound. Sometimes what looks like distance is someone fighting an invisible battle. Sometimes the person who appears strongest is carrying a history they never learned how to explain. And tonight, in this fictional message of spiritual reflection, heaven is drawing your attention towards something deeper than appearances, because the truth about this person may surprise you in a way you never expected. Stay with these words, because the first revelation is only the surface. You have been looking at their actions, their silence, their changes in tone, the moments when they seemed close and then suddenly far away. You have noticed contradictions. One day they appeared certain about you, and another day they seemed frightened by the very connection they once welcomed. One moment they gave you warmth, and in the next they guarded themselves so carefully that you wondered whether you had imagined everything. But what if those contradictions were never proof that their feelings were false? What if they were evidence that something inside them was divided? What if the person you love has been standing between who they learned to become and who they truly are underneath all that protection? There is a reason you could never fully read them. They learned long ago how to reveal only enough of themselves to feel connected while keeping the deepest chambers of their heart locked. They became skilled at smiling while thinking about things they would never say aloud. They learned how to answer, "I'm fine," when the truth would have taken hours to explain. They learned how to change the subject whenever a conversation came too close to something painful. And because they mastered this kind of emotional hiding, even people who have known them for years may not truly know what lives beneath their calm exterior. But you touched something different in them. Without always realizing it, you came close to the part they had protected the longest. That is where the story changes. Because the person you thought was simply distant may actually be terrified of being understood. The person you thought was emotionally unavailable may have once been emotionally open enough to be deeply hurt. The person you assumed did not care enough may care so intensely that their own feelings overwhelm them. They do not always know what to do with closeness when it becomes real. Surface-level affection is easy for them. Genuine emotional exposure is not. When they begin to realize that someone might actually see beyond their image, beyond their practiced confidence, beyond the personality they show the world, something inside them becomes restless. And you have seen that restlessness. You may remember moments when everything between you seemed strangely natural, almost effortless. They looked at you differently. Their voice softened. They listened longer than usual. They remembered details you did not expect them to remember. They found reasons to remain near you or keep the conversation alive. Then something shifted. Perhaps they became quieter. Perhaps they became inconsistent. Perhaps they withdrew without giving you a reason that made sense. You may have blamed yourself during those moments, wondering what you had done wrong. But there was another possibility you could not see. The closeness itself may have frightened them because it began to awaken a version of themselves they had buried. There is something they have rarely admitted even to themselves: they do not fully recognize the person they become around you. That sentence matters. Around most people, they know the role they are supposed to play. They know when to laugh, when to stay guarded, when to appear unaffected, when to keep conversation safely above the surface. They understand the expectations around them. They may be known as the responsible one, the strong one, the private one, the charming one, the difficult one, the independent one, or even the person who supposedly does not need anyone. That identity became familiar. Familiar identities can feel safe, even when they are lonely. But then you appeared, and the pattern did not work the same way. You began to make them feel things their usual personality could not easily contain. They wanted to tell you more than they normally tell people. They wanted you to see parts of their world they keep private. They found themselves imagining conversations with you before those conversations happened. They may have replayed your words afterward, wondering whether you understood what they almost said. They noticed when your energy changed. They noticed when you became distant. They noticed when you were trying to act like something did not hurt you. And perhaps the greatest surprise of all is this: for someone who has spent years pretending not to need emotional closeness, your presence began to expose how deeply they actually desire it. But there is another layer. The person you love has been carrying a belief about themselves that has quietly shaped almost every important relationship in their life. Somewhere along the way, through disappointment, rejection, family expectations, a painful ending, or experiences they never properly healed from, they began to believe that love becomes dangerous once it becomes important. They may not consciously think those exact words, but their actions reveal the pattern. When something does not matter deeply, they can relax. When someone does not have the power to affect them, they can be open. But when a connection becomes meaningful, their defenses wake up. This is why they can sometimes seem most distant precisely when their feelings are strongest. It appears backwards because emotionally, it is backwards. Yet wounded hearts often build backward strategies for survival. They may want reassurance but refuse to ask for it. They may want closeness but create space. They may hope you will understand while giving you almost nothing to understand. They may miss you deeply and still hesitate to reach out. They may want to confess something and then convince themselves to stay silent. None of this excuses confusing behavior, and your heart still deserves clarity. But understanding the hidden pattern changes the story. And now comes something even more unexpected. There is a side of this person almost nobody sees, a side that is much softer than their exterior suggests. They think more deeply than they show. They carry memories longer than people realize. Words affect them more than they admit. Certain conversations stay in their mind for days. Certain moments with you have remained with them far beyond the moment itself. They may still remember the exact expression on your face during a conversation you barely recall. They may remember a small kindness you assumed went unnoticed. They may remember something vulnerable you shared and have quietly protected that knowledge because, despite everything, they never wanted to use your softness against you. That is not the person you expected, is it? You may have thought they forgot easily. They do not. You may have thought they moved on quickly. Sometimes they only become quieter. You may have assumed their silence meant absence of feeling. But some of their deepest emotional moments have happened when you were nowhere near them. There have been nights when they replayed situations between you and questioned whether they handled them correctly. There have been moments when they wanted to undo a sentence, rewrite a reaction, take back a cold response, or finally explain what was really happening inside them. There may have been times when they typed something and erased it because vulnerability felt too risky. Times when they almost reached out but stopped themselves because they were afraid the timing was wrong. Times when they wondered whether you had already decided what kind of person they were. And this is where the mystery deepens. Because they know you have seen contradictions in them. They know there were moments when their actions did not match the warmth they had shown before. They know there were moments when they created confusion. Whether or not they have admitted it aloud, part of them fears that you now see them through the lens of their worst moments. That thought troubles them more than you realize. They are afraid that the person who came closest to seeing their real heart may now believe the mask instead. But heaven, in this story, is showing you that the mask itself was built for a reason. They did not become guarded overnight. Their emotional walls were constructed slowly. One disappointment added a brick. One broken promise added another. One person who misunderstood them strengthened the structure. A moment when they finally opened up and regretted it placed another layer around the heart. Eventually, hiding became easier than explaining. Control felt safer than hope. Independence became more comfortable than admitting how much connection mattered. Then you challenged that structure without even trying. Not because you forced your way into their heart, but because something about you made the walls feel unnecessary for brief moments. That frightened them. Imagine spending years constructing a fortress and suddenly realizing one person can walk through the gate simply by being genuine. That is what your presence represented. You were not just another person they could categorize easily. You became a mirror. Around you, they saw both the person they had become and the person they might still be capable of becoming. And those two versions of themselves have been in conflict. One version says, stay protected. The other says, tell the truth. One version says, do not need anyone. The other whispers, you already care. One says, keep your distance before you lose control. The other keeps wondering what would happen if they finally stopped running from what they feel. This inner battle explains more than you know, but it is not the biggest revelation. There is something they have begun to understand about you. They once believed you entered their life to become part of a familiar pattern. Perhaps they expected the connection to fade. Perhaps they assumed you would eventually disappoint them, misunderstand them, lose interest, or become like people from their past. They may have unconsciously watched for evidence that would confirm those fears. But the longer they reflected on the connection, the more something began to disturb that old belief. You did not fit the pattern. Even when you made mistakes, there was something different. Even when distance appeared, they still felt your impact. Even when circumstances became confusing, the emotional significance did not disappear as easily as they expected. They began realizing that what frightened them about you was not that you resembled someone from their past. It was that you did not. You made new possibilities feel real. And new possibilities are terrifying to people who survived by expecting disappointment. The person you love may have spent a long time telling themselves they were protecting their peace, when in truth they were sometimes protecting their fear. There is a difference. Peace does not require pretending. Peace does not require emotional disappearance. Peace does not force someone to deny what their heart keeps bringing back to their attention. Avoidance can feel peaceful for a while because it removes immediate discomfort, but eventually the unanswered truth returns. For this person, it has returned. Something has been changing quietly within them. Their old explanation for everything no longer feels convincing. The stories they told themselves about why they should remain emotionally detached are beginning to weaken. They are questioning choices they once defended. They are remembering conversations they tried to forget. They are looking at their own behavior from a perspective they resisted before. And perhaps most importantly, they are beginning to realize that the version of themselves they presented to you was incomplete. Not entirely false. Incomplete. That difference changes everything. They were not necessarily pretending to care when they cared. They were pretending not to care when they cared more than they wanted anyone to know. They were not necessarily pretending to be strong. Their strength was real, but so was the vulnerability underneath it. They were not necessarily pretending to be independent. They can survive alone. What they hid was the fact that survival is no longer enough for them. They were not necessarily hiding some dramatic identity. What they were hiding was their emotional depth, their fear of intimacy, their regret, their tenderness, and perhaps a longing they did not know how to express without feeling exposed. But there is still something else. A moment happened recently in their inner world, a quiet moment that no one around them may have noticed. They were thinking about you, perhaps after seeing something that reminded them of you, hearing a phrase, passing a familiar place, looking through an old memory, or simply sitting alone when distractions became too quiet. And for once, they stopped arguing with themselves. Instead of asking, "How do I avoid this feeling?" they asked a different question. What if this feeling is trying to tell me something? That question opened a door. Behind that door was regret. Behind regret was honesty. And behind honesty was something they had been afraid to name. They began to understand that the issue was never simply whether they cared about you. Somewhere inside, they already knew they did. The real issue was whether they were willing to become emotionally honest enough to handle what caring about you demanded. Because real connection demands courage. It asks a person to communicate when disappearing would be easier. It asks them to take responsibility when pride wants to defend everything. It asks them to speak clearly when ambiguity feels safer. It asks them to risk being known. And this person has begun to realize that if they continue living entirely behind their defenses, they may protect themselves from pain while also protecting themselves from the very love they secretly desire. That realization has shaken them. You may not see the effect immediately. Internal awakenings do not always produce instant action. Sometimes the heart changes before behavior catches up. Sometimes someone spends days or weeks wrestling with a truth before they are brave enough to live differently. But the movement has begun. And now I want you to hear something for your own heart. Do not build your entire hope around someone else changing. Their growth is their responsibility. Their honesty is their responsibility. Their choices belong to them. You are not being asked to chase, rescue, persuade, or prove your worth. The purpose of this message is not to make you wait endlessly for another person. It is to remind you that appearances rarely tell the whole story and that your own peace must remain sacred while truth unfolds. There is strength in loving without abandoning yourself. There is wisdom in understanding someone without excusing everything. There is maturity in recognizing their wounds while still honoring your boundaries. And there is deep spiritual clarity in knowing that if a connection is meant to become healthier, both people must eventually meet in honesty. The person you love is being confronted by that truth now. Not by punishment. By reflection. Their life has been showing them patterns they can no longer ignore. They are beginning to see the cost of remaining hidden. They are beginning to understand how their silence affects others. They are beginning to recognize how often they expected people to understand things they never communicated. And although this realization is uncomfortable, it may become one of the most important turning points in their emotional life. Because underneath the person you thought they were is someone far more sensitive, far more reflective, and far more afraid of losing meaningful connection than they have ever admitted. But that is still not the final truth. There is a reason their attention keeps returning to you specifically. It is not only because they miss your presence. It is not only attraction. It is not only nostalgia. There is something you represented in their life that they did not recognize until distance, silence, or uncertainty forced them to look more carefully. With you, they felt something rare. They felt seen without having fully explained themselves. And that frightened them at first. But now it is becoming the very thing they cannot forget. There were moments when you understood the emotion behind their words, even when the words themselves were incomplete. Moments when you sensed they were struggling before they admitted anything. Moments when your presence softened them. Moments when they almost became honest simply because something about you made honesty feel possible. You may not have known how deeply those moments affected them. They did. They remember. And there is one memory in particular that keeps returning to them. A moment between you that seemed ordinary on the outside but changed something quietly inside them. Perhaps it was a look. Perhaps a conversation. Perhaps a simple act of kindness. Perhaps you said something they had waited years to hear from someone without realizing it. They did not tell you what that moment meant. They may even have acted as though it meant nothing. But after that moment, they knew you were becoming dangerous to the version of themselves that wanted to remain emotionally untouched. Not dangerous in a harmful sense. Dangerous to the mask. Dangerous to the old story. Dangerous to the belief that they could live forever without letting anyone truly know them. And so they pulled back. Now they understand why. The truth was never that you meant too little. The truth may have been that you began to mean too much. But there is another revelation forming, and this one reaches beyond emotion into decision. They have recently begun imagining what would happen if they finally told you the truth about themselves. Not the polished truth. Not the version designed to make them look good. The full truth. The mistakes. The fears. The reasons behind certain choices. The things they misunderstood. The feelings they minimized. The moments they regretted. The part of their story they assumed would make you see them differently. For a long time, that possibility terrified them because they believed being fully known would lead to rejection. But something has shifted. They are beginning to fear something else more. They are beginning to fear what happens if they never tell you. That is where part 1 must leave you, because the most important hidden truth has not yet been spoken. There is one specific thing this person has never explained to you, something connected to why they behaved so differently when the connection became serious, and once you understand what happened inside them during that turning point, several confusing moments may suddenly make sense. They have kept this truth behind silence, pride, and fear for longer than you realize. But the silence is becoming harder for them to maintain. And what they are finally beginning to admit about who they really are, and what you truly became to them, is not the truth you expected. There comes a moment when silence stops protecting the heart and begins imprisoning it. The person you love has reached closer to that moment than you realize. For so long, they believed that if they kept certain feelings hidden, everything would remain under control. They thought distance could protect them. They thought silence could prevent disappointment. They thought if they never revealed how deeply something affected them, no one could ever hold power over their heart again. But there is something they did not understand when they built those walls. A heart can hide from another person for a while, but eventually it becomes impossible to hide from itself. And that is what has been happening. The truth they have avoided is becoming louder. Not because someone forced it out of them. Not because they suddenly became fearless. Something much quieter has been taking place. They have begun noticing how exhausting it is to maintain a version of themselves that no longer reflects what they truly feel. They have begun recognizing how many conversations they never finished, how many emotions they disguised, how many times they acted unaffected while carrying the moment with them afterward. And whenever their mind returns to you, one question keeps appearing beneath everything else. What would have happened if I had simply been honest? That question has become difficult to escape. There was a turning point between you that they remember differently than you might imagine. You may remember it as the moment they became distant, uncertain, or unusually guarded. Perhaps you thought their feelings changed. Perhaps you wondered whether another person had become more important. Perhaps you believed they had finally decided you were not what they wanted. But inside them, something entirely different was happening. They had realized you could hurt them. Not because you were trying to hurt them. Because you mattered enough that losing you suddenly felt possible. Before that realization, they could enjoy the connection without confronting what it meant. They could tell themselves it was casual, temporary, manageable, something they could walk away from if necessary. Then something happened. Maybe you looked at them with unusual tenderness. Maybe you revealed something vulnerable. Maybe you pulled away for a moment and they felt your absence more strongly than expected. Maybe another person mentioned you and they reacted internally before they could control it. Whatever the moment was, it created a realization they were not prepared for. They were emotionally invested. And instead of moving closer, they became afraid. This is the hidden contradiction that explains so much. They did not pull away because nothing was happening inside them. They pulled away because too much was happening inside them at once. Their old survival instincts returned immediately. Be careful. Do not reveal too much. Do not let anyone become necessary. Do not give another person the ability to leave you devastated. Do not repeat the past. So they listened to fear instead of vulnerability. But there was something about you their old defenses could not erase. They could create distance, but they could not erase significance. They could become quiet, but they could not make the memories disappear. They could convince themselves to focus elsewhere, but eventually something small would bring you back into their thoughts. A song. A familiar expression. A place. A conversation with someone else. A quiet evening when there was nothing left to distract them. And each time you returned to their mind, they were forced to confront the same uncomfortable truth. The connection had changed them. Perhaps not dramatically on the outside. Perhaps nobody around them could see it. But internally, they began comparing who they were before knowing you with who they became afterward. They noticed they were questioning things they once accepted without thought. They noticed they wanted deeper conversations. They noticed that shallow connections no longer satisfied them the same way. They began noticing the difference between receiving attention and being understood. And slowly, painfully, they realized that much of what they once called independence was actually emotional self-protection. That realization opened another door. Behind it was a memory they had buried. Long before you became important to them, someone taught them a painful lesson about vulnerability. It may have been a romantic relationship. It may have been a family dynamic. It may have been someone they trusted deeply. The details matter less than the emotional imprint it left behind. They learned that opening the heart could be followed by disappointment. They learned that saying what you need does not guarantee anyone will stay. They learned that promises can change. They learned that someone can know your softest places and still walk away. And somewhere inside them, they made a quiet promise. Never again. Never again would they give another person enough access to completely break them. Never again would they depend emotionally on someone who could disappear. Never again would they reveal everything. For years, that promise looked like strength. Then you came along. You did not know you were walking into a battle that began long before you arrived. That is important for your heart to understand. Some of their reactions to you were never entirely about you. Sometimes you touched an old wound without knowing it existed. Sometimes your silence reminded them of another silence. Sometimes uncertainty awakened memories of abandonment. Sometimes your closeness triggered the fear that closeness eventually becomes loss. They were reacting not only to the present moment but to years of emotional history that you could not see. Yet something unusual happened. You did not only awaken their fear. You awakened their hope. And hope was even more frightening. Fear is familiar to someone who has lived defensively for years. Hope is dangerous because it asks them to imagine a different ending. Around you, they began imagining one. That is the truth they have struggled hardest to admit. At some point, they stopped thinking only about the present and began wondering what a future involving you might actually look like. Not necessarily in dramatic fantasies, but in small, intimate images. Talking to you after a difficult day. Sharing ordinary moments. Knowing what makes you laugh when no one else is around. Being present for your victories. Watching you become more of who you are meant to become. Letting you see them without the performance. Those thoughts frightened them because suddenly there was something to lose. And so the mask became stronger. They may have acted more detached than they felt. They may have spoken casually about things that mattered deeply. They may have hidden jealousy behind indifference. They may have pretended not to notice when your attention shifted elsewhere. They may have avoided asking questions because they feared the answers. They may even have convinced themselves that staying quiet was somehow protecting both of you. But silence rarely protects a connection forever. Eventually, silence creates its own consequences. They have begun realizing that now. Something recently caused them to see themselves from your perspective. Perhaps they remembered a conversation and imagined what their silence must have looked like to you. Perhaps they thought about a moment when you needed clarity and they gave you confusion. Perhaps someone spoke to them about relationships in a way that unexpectedly reminded them of you. Whatever triggered it, they suddenly saw something they had avoided seeing. You could not read their mind. You could only judge the connection by what they actually showed you. And that realization hurt. Because inside their heart, the story felt completely different from the story their behavior may have told. Inside, there were feelings. Outside, there was hesitation. Inside, there was longing. Outside, there was distance. Inside, there were conversations they wanted to have. Outside, there was silence. And for perhaps the first time, they understood how unfair it was to expect you to recognize emotions they refused to communicate. That realization has begun changing something. But listen carefully, because this is where your own journey enters the story. You were never meant to spend your life decoding another person's silence. Love should not require endless guessing. Compassion is beautiful, but compassion without boundaries becomes exhaustion. Understanding someone's wounds does not mean sacrificing your own peace. Seeing the reason behind their behavior does not mean pretending their behavior never affected you. You can understand why someone built walls and still refused to live outside those walls forever. Your heart deserves reciprocity. Your heart deserves clarity. Your heart deserves someone courageous enough to meet you where honesty lives. And perhaps that is precisely why this connection has reached such an important spiritual crossroads. Because the person you love is being confronted with a choice. Not necessarily a choice between you and another person. A deeper choice. The person they have always been versus the person they are becoming. The protected version versus the authentic version. Fear versus truth. Silence versus communication. And they are beginning to understand that remaining unchanged may cost them something precious. There is one thing they regret more than they have admitted. It is not simply a missed conversation. It is a moment when you gave them an opening. You may not even remember it clearly. There was a point when you made it easier for them to be honest. Perhaps you asked a question. Perhaps you showed vulnerability first. Perhaps you gave them reassurance. Perhaps you simply stayed long enough for them to know you were willing to listen. For a few seconds, they almost told you everything. They almost explained why they were afraid. They almost admitted how important you had become. They almost told you what was happening beneath their changing behavior. But then fear interrupted. They said something safer. They changed the subject. They became quiet. Maybe they laughed. Maybe they acted unaffected. Maybe they gave you an answer that was technically true but emotionally incomplete. And afterward, they regretted it. That moment stayed with them because somewhere inside, they knew the connection might have changed if they had been courageous enough to speak. Now they wonder whether another opportunity will come. That question has followed them into quiet moments. Would you still listen? Would you understand? Would you believe them? Would you think the explanation came too late? Would you see them differently if you knew everything? These questions are part of why they have remained hesitant. But one question has begun becoming stronger than the others. What if I never tell them and lose the chance forever? That thought has unsettled them deeply. Because despite everything they have tried to convince themselves, they do not want their final place in your story to be a misunderstanding. They do not want you remembering them only as someone who did not care. They do not want their fear to become the only evidence you ever receive. They do not want the mask to become their legacy in your heart. And this is where the truth about who they really are becomes surprising. The person you thought was emotionally cold may actually feel things with unusual intensity. The person you thought moved on without looking back may have revisited the past more often than you know. The person you thought had all the power may have felt powerless whenever emotions became too real. The person you thought did not need reassurance may have secretly wanted reassurance but did not know how to ask for it. The person you thought had already decided everything may still be wrestling with a decision they never expected to face. But there is something even they did not know about themselves until recently. They are capable of changing. For a long time, they believed, this is simply who I am. Private. Guarded. Independent. Difficult to read. But now they are beginning to understand that personality and protection are not always the same thing. Some traits they called personality were actually armor. Some habits they called independence were actually fear. Some boundaries they believed were healthy were actually walls designed to keep everyone at a distance. And once a person realizes the difference between identity and armor, the armor becomes much harder to wear comfortably. They are beginning to feel its weight. That is why something about them may seem different if your paths cross emotionally again. You may notice pauses where there used to be quick answers. You may notice softness where there used to be defensiveness. You may notice them choosing words more carefully. You may notice an attempt, however imperfect, to explain something they once would have avoided. But remember this, transformation is proven by consistent action, not beautiful words alone. Do not surrender your discernment simply because someone finally becomes emotional. Watch what they do. Watch whether they take responsibility. Watch whether communication becomes clearer. Watch whether their actions begin matching the truth they claim to feel. Because genuine love does not ask you to abandon wisdom. The deepest connections are not sustained by intensity alone. They are sustained by truth. And the person you love is beginning to understand this. There is another secret hidden beneath their hesitation, however, and this one changes the meaning of several things that happened between you. They were not only afraid of being hurt. They were afraid they would hurt you. That possibility troubled them more than you knew. Somewhere inside, they believed they were too complicated, too wounded, too inconsistent, or simply not ready to give you what you deserved. Rather than admit that insecurity, they may have hidden behind distance. It felt easier to make you believe they were uninterested than to admit they were afraid they might disappoint you. Think about the contradiction. They may have hurt you while trying not to hurt you. They may have created confusion because they were afraid honesty would create pain. They may have pushed you away because they believed closeness would eventually expose everything they disliked about themselves. That does not erase the consequences.